Hey guys, I'm Sophia. So you can either be watching this or listening to this. If you listen, it will go straight out into your subconscious and you're going to remember it for the exam if you're doing past papers and all of that kind of revision by yourself as well. But I'm basically going to be taking you through the spec of Russian history today. So yeah, let's get into it. This is an introductory video, so if you're new to like year 12 or you just want a kind of summary of the whole course, just to help you guide your revision when you're starting, this is the video to be watching. So studying Imperial Russia, it's a breadth study. So you look at everything. It's a long period of time. It's not a depth study, but breadth basically asks you to consider issues of change, continuity, cause, and consequence in this period through the following key questions. So these are the kind of questions you want to be thinking about throughout your studies, of course. So how was Russia governed? How did political authority change and develop? Why did opposition develop and how effective was it? How and with what results did the economy develop and change? What was the extent of social and cultural change? How important were ideas and ideology? And how important was the role of individuals and groups, and how were they affected by developments? Now that we've run through the most important key questions, we're going to go through each of the topics. So I'm going to start in autocracy, reform, and revolution. So this is the topics you'll likely cover in year 12. These are the years 1855 to 1917. So this also covers if you're studying the AS level, AQA. And the first part is trying to preserve autocracy from 1855 to 1894. We begin looking at political authority and the state of Russia. So this is very much an autocratic time of Russia, and we're going to look at the political, social, and economic condition of Russia in 1855 and the impact of the Crimean War. We're then going to look at political authority and attempts at reform. So we've got Alexander II, who did the whole emancipation of the serfs and attempts at domestic and military reform. I remember there was a question that came up so many times about whether his reforms were half-hearted. Definitely you need to be thinking about that, because as much as he tried with the reforms, a lot of them did fail. And then we're going to look at the government and Tsars, Alexander II and Alexander III as rulers, their attitudes to and their imposition of autocracy, and then the key developments that happened in this era from 1855 to 94. We're also going to look at political authority, so Russification, which was essentially the Russians were characterized by their culture, speaking the Russian language, and their religion, so Orthodoxy, which is a type of Christianity that was very Russian. And then their treatment of ethnic minorities. So they weren't really very fond of ethnic minorities, even though there were a lot living in Russia at that time, especially Jews. Alexander III was extremely anti-Semitic. We've got opposition. This is a very significant part of this. We think about their ideas and ideologies, the different individuals who were important at this time, like the intelligentsia, and key figures. So there was this one girl who shot someone, and yeah, we'll get into that. We've got the liberals and the radical groups and the Tsarist reaction. So how did the Tsar react? Did he care? Did he not do anything? Was he just completely hopeless? We'll find out. And then we've got the economic and social developments. So that includes industrial developments, because of course Russia was trying to industrialize at this time, and the land issue. So they were using very, very much outdated farming techniques. And then you've got social divisions. And then we think about the nobles, landowners, and position of the peasantry. The peasants made up about 80% of the population, which is crazy. And then you've got the nobles and the landowners. Landowners weren't that wealthy, they were, but not as much as the nobles. And then you've got the cultural influence of the church. One resource that's going to be extremely valuable to your time studying the course of Tsarist and Communist Russia is this AQA textbook, because it's got pretty much everything in the specification that you need to know. But in addition to this, reading this textbook, you are going to be also doing some reading outside of that. If you're a history student, you understand that you need to be doing further reading books, articles. If you have good teachers, they will give you the further reading to do. But there are definitely some good historians that you need to kind of learn from. One thing that's super important that you need to keep in mind when you're studying this period of Russia is the dates are a little bit off because they used an old style, but some textbooks use new style. So you just have to kind of pick one and run with it. And for every like date that you want to remember, you need to pick old style or new style, whichever one you want to use, and just make sure you like stay consistent or just remember which one is which. Otherwise it just gets quite confusing. Okay, so in 1855, Russia was an empire, which basically means it's a group of like smaller states who were ruled over by like a more powerful state. Russia at this time was ruled by the Tsar, who was said to have absolute power of Russia, and he was chosen by God. So he was like, the head of the church, had pretty much all of the power. That is what an autocracy is. One person holds all of the power. And this is a very outdated concept, hence 1855. But it does carry on for a while. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna read you guys a passage that is extremely important in summing up the Russian autocracy in 1855. This is from Robert Service, A History of 20th Century Russia. So it says, the Russian Empire was deeply divided between the government and the Tsar's subjects, between the capital and the provinces, between the educated and the uneducated, which was most people, by the way, between Western and Russian ideas, between the rich and the poor, between privilege and oppression, between contemporary fashion and centuries-old custom. Most people, and over 90% of the emperor's subjects, were born and bred in the countryside, felt that a chasm divided them from the world inhabited by the ruling elites. This is what autocratic Russia was like. Russia was an empire, but national consciousness was only partially developed, and local traditions and loyalties retained the greatest influence. National consciousness was not a dominant sentiment among Russians, except in times of war. Most of them were motivated by Christian belief, peasant customs, village loyalties, and reverence for the Tsar, rather than by feelings of Russian nationhood. Christianity itself was a divisive phenomenon. Russian Orthodox teachings were not accepted universally because the Orthodox Church was kind of like taken away from the Christian Church. It became its own kind of division. But the Tsar and the church hierarchy wanted obedience, and they had the authority to secure just that. So a little bit of like religious context. The Tsar was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and was regarded by Orthodox believers as the embodiment of God on earth. So you basically had God, the Tsar, everyone else. The vast lands of the Russian Empire was his private property, and the Russian people were his children. So they really regarded the Tsar affectionately. They loved him a lot, and they weren't very educated at this time. They would sometimes refer to him affectionately as Batushka, which means father in Russian. There are going to be some Russian words that come up in the course as well that you will be remembering by the end of the course, especially near the end when you have to think about all the political structures. But because Russians were taught and believed that like they really needed to devote themselves to the Tsar, believing that he was like the closest thing to God, they just accepted their like role as a peasant, as a serf, as just the will of God. They didn't really know any better. So the Patriarch of Moscow, who worked in close harmony with the Tsar, provided spiritual guidance. So in 1855, I must stress, Alexander was appointed as Tsar. Alexander II. The Patriarch of Moscow provided spiritual guidance, while the Overprocurator of the Holy Synod, which was a post created in 1721, was a government minister appointed by the Tsar to run church affairs. So he basically did all of that. So the structures of the church and the state were like entwined, as archbishops and bishops at the head of the church hierarchy were subject to Tsarist control over appointments, religious education, most of the church's finances, and issues of administration. And then politically, so the Tsar's imperial edicts were the law of the land. So the Tsar, of course, had advisors and ministers, but these were all chosen by the Tsar himself. They couldn't do anything without his approval. So it was very much an autocratic regime. The Tsar had all of the power. Main advisory bodies were the Imperial Council, which was around 35 to 60 noblemen, picked by the Tsar to advise him personally and provide their expert opinion. And then you had the Council of Ministers, which was a body of 8 to 14 ministers in charge of different government departments. The Tsar and the central government were still based in St. Petersburg, which was the imperial capital. However, they did still rely on provincial nobles, so people outside of the capital. Nobles had not been obliged to serve the states, but many continued to. All landowners were expected to keep order on their estates. So Russia also had a bureaucracy, which is, instead of elected representatives, they had state officials to make decisions, and the civil servants who made up this bureaucracy were paid noble officials selected from a table of ranks that laid down the requirements for office. So there were 14 different levels held by members of the Council of Ministers to positions, for example, collecting taxes or running a provincial post office. Each rank had its own uniform, form of address, or status. This bureaucracy was riddled by internal corruption and incompetence. Orders were passed from the central government to the provincial governors and in turn district governors and town commandants. It was a one-way operation, so there was no provision for suggestions to travel upwards from the lower ranks. So everything was basically filtered down. The top would control this level, and then this level, and this level. The Tsar also had the world's largest army at his disposal, so that was made up of 1.5 million serfs who were forced into service for 25 years. And the serfs were peasants, which made up 80% of Russia's population, around 67 to 69 million. They were made to live in a military colony, so all the conscript serfs would live with their families and train under very, very strict military discipline. So life was pretty hard for them, but the higher ranks of the military were very prestigious posts and belonged to the nobles who would buy and sell their commissions. Military spending made up about 45% of annual government spending, so almost half. The army could be called upon by the Tsar to fight in wars or to solve disturbances or uprisings in Russia. The Tsar also had the service of elite regiments of mounted Cossacks, who were peasants from Ukraine or southern Russia, known for their skills in horsemanship and strong military tradition. So these guys were very, very strong. I don't know if you've heard of the term Cossack squat, but that's what it's from. And they had special social privileges. The Cossacks would act basically as either the Tsar's personal bodyguard or as police reinforcements. If we go back to the army, the Crimean War lasted from 1853 to 1856, and by the time Alexander II came to the throne as Tsar, Russia was losing the Crimean War very badly, exposing the military's severe weaknesses. So despite the 45% of government spending being on the military and discipline being very harsh, the serfs that were fighting in the army, of course it was forced conscription, so they had very low morale. They didn't really want to be there. They had poor training from nobles who would buy and sell their posts just for the prestige of it. And they had outdated weapons. So not only was Russia using outdated farming methods, they were using outdated weapons. Compared to Britain and France, Russia's military lacked modern equipment, ships, and rail transport. Russia was also very, very big, so communication between states was quite difficult. So obviously for the Tsar to maintain his position as autocrat, the country had developed a police state to maintain control over the people. So this state made people really, really scared, basically, and prevented freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and travel abroad. Political meetings and strikes were forbidden. Censorship existed at every level of government, and the police made sure that censorship exercised by the state and the church was enforced. The secret state security network was run by the third section of the Emperor's Imperial Council. The third section was essentially the secret police. Its agents kept a strict surveillance over the population and had unlimited powers to carry out raids and to arrest or imprison or send into exile anyone suspected of anti-Tsarist behavior. They would sometimes act on the word of informers and were greatly feared. So if you didn't like someone, you could just snitch on them and say, like, this person is talking bad about you, and they'll probably get sent to prison, or worse. So the economic situation was also pretty bad. When Alexander II came to the throne in 1855, Britain, Belgium, France, and the states comprising Germany were already well advanced industrially. Mills, factories, coal pits, quarries, and railways were transforming the landscape, and trade was flourishing. However, the Russian economy remained mostly rural, with a ratio of 11:1 village to town dwellers compared with 2:1 in Britain. There were good reasons for Russia's economic backwardness. Although the Russian Empire was vast, much of its territory was inhospitable. Tundra forests and stretches of barren countryside, especially to the north and east. It was like freezing cold as well, and it was huge. They didn't really have transport to get things from one place to another, so a lot of land was not being taken advantage of. Siberia, for example, like where people were sent to exile, it was freezing cold. Although mid-19th century Russia was Europe's main exporter of agricultural produce and possessed huge reserves of timber, coal, oil, gold, and other precious metals, much of its potential remained untapped, and communications between the different parts of the empire were poor. However, the lack of progress was primarily due to Russia's commitment to a serf-based economy. The land-owning aristocracy, Tsarist government, and the army were all reliant on the serfs. This inhibited economic development by limiting the forces that drive change, like wage earners, markets, and entrepreneurs. Because of course, if people are being peasants, they're not going to go and start their own business. The serfs were very poor. Most just about managed to survive on the produce they grew for themselves on the land made available by their landlords. They often suffered with starvation in the winter, particularly in years of bad harvests, and systems of land management within the serf communes, which were called mirs in Russian, meant that individual serf families worked scattered strips and were obliged to follow a communal pattern of farming. So therefore, there was very little incentive or opportunity for the serfs to develop into wage earners. Let's go into serfdom in a little bit more depth, because these were very, very important people. Okay, they made up so much of the Russian population. So these Russian peasants, serfs, were men, women, and children who were classified as the property of their owners rather than as citizens of the state. Serfs could be bought and sold, subject to beatings, and were not allowed to marry without permission of their owners. Serfs were also liable for conscription into the army, as we've seen. There were two main types of peasants. Little over half privately owned, and around 30% of these paid rent to their owners, and then around 70% provided labor. The remainder were state serfs who paid taxes and rent. Most serfs worked on the land in village communes, so like mirs, run by strict rules imposed by village elders. Back to the economy. Markets did exist in Russia, okay, and were growing at this time, but business was mostly small scale. The most common peasant purchases were vodka for celebrations and drinking, metal tools, and salt to preserve food, which they bought in the nearest town or at a fair. However, self-sufficiency meant that comparatively few goods were actually purchased, and in peasant markets, money was not the usual form of payment. Exchanges took place in kind. So, for example, some eggs might be given in return for a length of wool. In some areas, market forces were beginning to develop as peasants sought wage work in nearby towns at slack times in the farming year, but for the vast majority, money was simply irrelevant and there was no internal market demand. At the other end of the scale was the small landowning elites, who obtained most of what they needed from their serfs in the form of service and feudal dues. So they were generally uninterested in how efficiently their estates operated, so long as their bailiffs squeezed sufficient amounts of the peasants for their own benefit. The aristocratic landowners saw little need to do more. So there was no opportunity for capital accumulation since income was generally falling. This was thanks to the rural population growth, population growth in this countryside, and the agricultural changes in Western Europe that had increased the competitiveness and productivity of the European markets. Many landowners had been forced into debt and had to take out mortgages on estates which has previously been owned outright by their families. Sometimes they even mortgaged their serfs, but despite their despair, they did not seek alternative ways of making money because money was of little use in Russia's underdeveloped economy. As you know, exchanges were mostly done in kind. The main reason that farming in Russia was so outdated was because the serfs were illiterate, but they were deeply religious and very opposed to change. While in agriculture, they had crop rotations, new fertilizers, and developments in agricultural machinery, in contrast with the serfs working in living conditions where it was normal for corn to be cut by hand with sickles and for peasants to share their huts with other animals, so it was quite primitive, but they didn't want change, so that's just how it was. Socially, Russia was very, very divided into the privileged land-owning elites and the serf majority, and then the non-productive and the productive classes. Serfs were largely farmed their own food, so they did like self-sufficient farming, where basically they would farm their food and they would eat it, not sell it to other people. And they used traditional ways of working the soil, and levels of productivity were barely higher than those of the Middle Ages, so there was really like barely any development. In some areas, market forces were in fact beginning to transform village life, while government revenues came increasingly from commercial sources. At the upper level of society, the increasingly westernized outlook of Russian elites undermined the autocratic political culture of Russia's ruling group. The government became aware of how threatening these various changes might be to its own power only in the middle of the 19th century. The privileged land-owning elite were largely consisted of the clergy, so like people who work in church, nobility, civil and military officials appointed by the Tsar, army and naval officers, because of course prestigious posts in the military, and at the very top, the royal court. In addition to the serfs, there were some urban artisans, manufacturers, and merchants within the ranks of the productive classes. But the striking feature of mid-19th century Russia was the absence of any coherent middle class. But in Europe, the middle class was becoming pretty dominant. There were a small number of professionals, so doctors, teachers, lawyers, some of whom comprised an educated intelligentsia, which we will talk about more in detail later on. But these were often the sons of noblemen, or sometimes the sons and daughters of priests. In 1855, legal barriers still limited social mobility. Serfs were liable for dues, as demanded by past custom, to their masters. From their master's bond, it was almost impossible for them to escape. They also paid direct and indirect taxes to the government. The nobility and clergy were exempt from paying taxes. Government was mostly financed by taxes and dues paid by the serfs. The main direct tax, paid by everyone except merchants, was the poll tax, which had been introduced in 1719 in order to cover the cost of maintaining Russia's large army, and was levied at the same rate on every male peasant in the empire, no matter his circumstances. This, with the obrok paid by the state serfs in lieu of land, and service dues made up 25% of ordinary government income. Indirect taxes, so on services and goods, included a tax on salt and on vodka. This had grown during the 19th century to represent 30% of ordinary government income by 1855, suggesting a change was already underway towards a more commercial source of income revenue. Overall, the taxes hit hard the peasantry, who, with the urban people and tradespeople, provided around 90% of imperial finance. So, in conclusion, Russian autocracy in 1955, while it was considered a great power in Europe because of its size and huge army, politically, economically, and socially, it remained very backwards compared with the West. Just one last thing, when considering the Crimean War and how much of a disaster it was for the Russians. So in 1856, there was the Treaty of Paris, and the Russians lost so badly that Russian warships were prevented from using the Black Sea in times of peace. And the Crimean War was fought by Russia, Britain, France, and Turkey. And it was very much a wake-up call for Alexander II. So we get to see like his reforms that followed on from them. I really hope you guys learned something or at least enjoyed watching the video.